And welcome to session 9, Walking Together for Indigenous Outcomes. So my name's Russell Barnett. I'm a partner with a firm called Australian Venture Consultants. We sort of specialise in policy and strategy in the primary and extractive industries across the country. And I have an honorary associate professorship at the ANU's First Nations portfolio where I do a bit of work on economic self-determination. So I've been honoured to be appointed to chair this session. I want to start by acknowledging the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners on which Canberra is located, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and thank Auntie Selena for her very warm and generous welcome to country yesterday. Joining me in this discussion, we have a panel of esteemed experts in First Nations primary production. My furthest left is Emma Lee, OAM. So Emma is a professorial research fellow at the Federation University. She's a Trowulwoi woman of Tebra Kuna, which is traditional lands are in northeast Tasmania. And Emma has done an enormous amount of work establishing commercial markets for First Nations produced seafood products in Tasmania. Online, we have Angela Huston. Angela coming up. There she is. Welcome, Angela. So Angela is a Kamilaroi woman from southwest Queensland, has extensive background in First Nations commerce and as a CPA. She's currently performing leadership roles with Bush Tucker, which is a business commercialising native foods, and the Botanicals Indigenous Enterprise Cooperative. Sitting next to Emma, we have Jennifer Mason. So Jennifer's ancestry incorporates Wamba Wamba peoples from the Lower Darling and Murray River regions in New South Wales and Victoria, and the Dudawarawa people in northeast Victoria. Jennifer has a postdoctorate research fellow at ANU School of Cultural History, Language, Gender, Media and Cultural Studies, and has an extensive career in planning and implementing economic and social programs at the community level. And then last but not least, we have Rohan Jacobsen, who's a research scientist with ABARES. He's doing a lot of work in the sort of geospatial delineation of the First Nations estate. So just to kick things off, I just wanted to give a really quick sort of couple of minutes history of First Nations primary production, both before colonisation and post-colonisation. So there's now an extensive body of evidence in academic and practice literature, and not to mention the stories of First Nations people that have been handed down from generation to generation, that from over the 65,000 years that First Nations people have occupied this continent, there has been a sophisticated process of managing natural resources and ecosystems to optimise the harvest of food and fibre. So we can look at practices like fire to encourage the regeneration of traditional produce, the creating of grazing areas that attract game for ease of harvesting, sophisticated fish traps and aquaculture-like structures and the like. There are incidences of sort of what we would sort of consider more conventional farming practices, but those practices were tailored for a land where we're characterised by very impoverished soils and fauna that doesn't lend itself easy to domestication. So that account of First Nations history has been a little bit controversial. But there is ample evidence in the academic literature that is the case. Colonisation had a very profound impact on the First Nations of Australia, as we all know, and it would be hard to find an industry that has had a more profound impact than the primary industries. So as settlers were given land grants and released convicts land grants, and the population emanated out of the coastal settlements, obviously agriculture was undertaken, livestock was introduced, crops were planted. This was a major catalyst for dispossession of natural resources. So First Nations people were moved off their customary lands. That sort of started in the southeast and the southwest and then went into the interior and across the north. We saw high levels of incarceration of First Nations people when they broke laws that were put on them by colonisers that weren't necessarily contraventions of their own law. We saw moments of slavery, certainly discriminatory employment, murders, state-sanctioned massacres. And these are, again, all very well documented. And this industry, the primary industry of Australia, was a major vector for that. In the sort of, I guess, the first half of the 20th century and sort of the later 19th century, we saw the introduction of at least some relative harmony. So established pastoralists frequently allowed First Nations people to live on their traditional lands on what were now, under the Western legal systems, their pastoral properties, practice their customary practices, and for either food or working at indiscriminatory terms. But at least First Nations were people back living on their customary lands. Then in the sort of 1960s, late 1960s, there was some industrial action. So the famous Wave Hill walk-off with Vincent Lingari, and then the 1968 ruling by the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission that First Nations pastoral workers were entitled to the award. That then resulted in mass layoffs as pastoralists decided that First Nations people didn't work as well as white people, and so they got fired. And we saw what was quite often referred to as the refugee crisis, particularly across northern Australia. So large numbers of First Nations people again pushed off their traditional lands into the townships, living in sort of makeshift communities. And that was the start of the insidious impacts of the welfare crisis that ran through the 70s. It's fair to say that things started to change, I guess, in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. So we started to see a reclamation of rights by First Nations people. We can go back to the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of the Northern Territory, Commonwealth piece of legislation, that started giving some Western legal rights to First Nations people over their traditional lands and to a lesser extent waters. That gathered pace through the 90s, so Native Title Act is the obvious example of that. Several important jurisprudence, so High Court Wick decision, Blue Mud Bay decision, the WA Supreme Court Ward decision, and the High Court Akiba decision, which all pertain to primary industries and First Nations rights therein. And then increasing activity by organisations such as the Indigenous Land and Sea Council Corporation, initially acquiring agricultural properties and divesting them with traditional owners, and then as a result of the amendments over the last few years, sea country rights, so fishing rights and other water rights. So this has had a really important outcome. If we look at the landscape today, there are hundreds of First Nations owned and operated agricultural and fisheries businesses across the country. They're in every state and territory of Australia. They operate in sectors as diverse as mainstream beef, broadacre farming, through to just pure traditional harvest of traditional produce and horticultural production of that. They employ a wide range of business models that include just the standard conventional agricultural or fishing business model through to those that incorporate aspects of culture. So they may brand using cultural exhibits of cultural display and design. They may use traditional harvesting methods, food preparation methods, and other things from traditional knowledge. And they exist on a range of tenures. So everything from fee simple farming tenure in the southeast or southwest through to pastoral stations that have exclusive native title over them. So we can sort of sit here today and say that whilst the primary industries had a devastating effect on First Nations people from colonisation for at least a couple of hundred years, that tide is perhaps starting to turn, and First Nations are becoming an important part of the modern Australian primary industries. And as I said before, the reclamation of rights across land, sea country, freshwater, intellectual property, and some financial assets has been driving that. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Jacob to set the scene by giving an overview of the work he's been doing, defining and describing the First Nation state across Australia.
Well, Yuma, and hello and good afternoon. Thank you, Russ. My name's Rohan Jacobsen, and I'm in the Forest and Land Sciences program in ABARES, which importantly is the S part of ABARES that we mustn't forget. So I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians on the lands that we're meeting this afternoon, and also to all other families with connections to the ACT and region. So for this afternoon's session on the significant contributions that First Nations people make in the agriculture, fisheries and forestry industry, I'll just provide a bit of a scene setting on how the portfolio, how the department is working towards empowering economic self-determination of First Nations peoples. And then I'll just share some of the insights from our work in ABARES on characterising the Indigenous land and forest estate, which today sits at 70% of the Australian continent, and also bring some of the value and outcomes from this work as well. So Russ provided an excellent introduction on the history and the long history of First Nations agriculture with cultivation and care for country. And this, as we know, has been ongoing for millennia. So today, to support and sustain this, the portfolio's First Nations commitment is a key component of our corporate governance, and it's embedded within our statement of strategic intent. So the commitment reflects the aspirations of First Nations peoples across the whole agriculture sector, and it drives multiple economic policy opportunities in pursuit of First Nations economic self-determination. Within the sector, there are still barriers that First Nations peoples face. In 2024, the department provided a submission into the inquiry into economic self-determination for First Nations peoples, and it identified that First Nations agribusinesses continue to face barriers such as difficulty accessing capital and finance, experiences of exclusion and racism in industry engagement, and also difficulty in securing and the challenges associated with accessing infrastructure and services within regional and remote and very remote areas. Despite these barriers, First Nations people play a key role in the modern sector's success. About 1.8% of people in the agricultural workforce identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And of that cohort, the greatest contribution, or 40%, were employed in the sheep, beef cattle and grain farming subsectors. And about 0.6% of business owners in the agriculture industry are First Nations businesses. So these numbers are likely a little bit underrepresented, but it does present that there are significant opportunities to work together to improve some of those outcomes for First Nations Australians in the sector. And indeed, increasing First Nations participation in the sector will also contribute to the sector's goal of being a $100 billion industry by 2030. So the significant contribution that First Nations businesses make to the Australian economy was highlighted in that inquiry into economic self-determination for First Nations Australians. And a key highlighted statistic from that was that for every dollar of revenue earned by a First Nations business, there is a fourfold increase in the social and economic value that is generated from that. So given the value opportunity there, the portfolio supports a number of programs in the sector which are designed to improve those opportunities. So just to name a few of those that are supported, there's the Indigenous Agricultural Product Framework, the Export Readiness Pilot for First Nations Agriculture, the Indigenous Ranger Biosecurity Program, there's First Nations support under the National Fisheries Plan, the Climate Smart Agricultural Program, First Nations support under the Future Drought Fund as well, and then also a national statement on First Nations in agriculture, fisheries and forestry, which is a statement agreed to by all agriculture ministers, all Australian agricultural ministers, with a goal to drive greater economic outcome and inclusion for First Nations Australians in agriculture. And the web link that's provided on there will, on our portfolio website, provides information on these programs as well as additional programs as well. So now we'll shift to some of ABARES' work on and our role in the First Nations commitment and some of our work on characterising the Indigenous estate. So ABARES has published the Indigenous land and forest estate for an extended period now. And for our purposes, we define the Indigenous estate as land or forest over which Indigenous peoples and communities have ownership, management or other rights of use for customary purpose. And our method captures some of those formal and legislated arrangements that Russell talked about, those Commonwealth and state and territory arrangements that recognise those attributes of ownership, management and other special rights for Indigenous peoples. And why does ABARES do this? So ABARES coordinates and produces the Australia State of the Forest report, which is a federated publication reporting on the multiple values and services provided by Australia's forests. And within the reporting framework, there are specific indicators that are focused on Indigenous people's interests to forest and also participation in forest management. And this is the primary driver for why we report on the forests that occur on the Indigenous estate. And so we'll just take a look at how we do this. So to visualise the Indigenous land and forest estate, we map the area of land that is Indigenous owned, land that has a formal Indigenous management arrangement, and an area where other special rights exist for Indigenous peoples. These are then combined and then they deliver a complex but a powerful view of the entire Indigenous land estate. For our reporting, we combine this with forest cover data, but for this session, we'll just stick with the entire Indigenous land estate. So our latest update to the Indigenous land and forest estate was published late last year, along with our latest Australia State of the Forest report synthesis for 2023. And it's also the latest update is the version that's shown on the screen here. So in this map, the colours applied relate to the various unique combinations of where ownership, management and other special rights are present, but also where they are absent. So to point out some of the examples that are shown within this map, the golden yellow areas that are present across much of the country is where other special rights are present, and this is typically non-exclusive native title or where there are Indigenous land use agreements, but this is where Indigenous ownership or management is absent. The dark red areas across South Australia and the Northern Territory is where Indigenous ownership and Indigenous management is present, and this is typically where there is freehold or freehold tenure land granted or owned by Indigenous communities. A familiar example of Kakadu National Park, which is in the blue area just at the Northern Territory top end, is an example of Indigenous owned land with a formal co-management arrangement, as Kakadu National Park has shared management arrangements between the traditional owners of Binin and Mungwi with Parks Australia. New South Wales here shows a little bit of a contrast relative to the rest of the continent, but there are currently active native title claims within New South Wales that are likely to add significant areas into the Indigenous estate in coming years. So it's important to note that there have been other and are other currently active Indigenous estate mapping efforts. We developed this method for our purposes, and also because, to the best of our knowledge, there has not been to date any coordinated or authoritative Indigenous estate mapping across government. So next we'll just have a look at a couple of the insights from the latest Indigenous estate compilation. So in short, the Indigenous estate covers most of Australia and the estate is expanding. So the total Indigenous land estate covers 70% of the Australian continent. And this is the total area with at least one of the attributes of Indigenous ownership, management or other special rights, and takes into account the overlap between those attributes. Notably is the size of the estate that is Indigenous owned, which covers 20% of Australia's land area. And mapping where Indigenous communities have the most complete form of land ownership can provide an opportunity or can provide insights into where potential commercial opportunities may exist. Furthermore, over the last 10 years, we've progressively built a picture on how the Indigenous estate is expanding. Today, the estate sits at 70% of Australia. Sovereignty was never ceded, so technically it's 100%, but this is a measure of those formal and legislated mechanisms that recognise Indigenous rights. So it's 70% today, but 10 years ago, applying the same method, this sat at 40%. So as those Commonwealth and state and territory arrangements continue to recognise land rights, it provides a greater opportunity, or there's further potential for economic opportunities on the Indigenous estate. But insights alone are of limited value unless they can contribute to actions and also provide value for the industry. So information on the forests on the Indigenous estate, as I mentioned, are published in our State of the Forest report. But this also underpins other ABARES resources and also informs the portfolio's policy development on Indigenous forestry opportunities. Our work has also informed publications for the Cooperative Research Centre for Developing Northern Australia. A couple shown here are on the opportunities in the northern forestry and forest products industry, and there's also some similar estate mapping completed by Russell and colleagues, has also been applied by the CRC to provide baseline information on the agricultural capacity of the Indigenous estate. And this is an important note with our Indigenous estate resource, is that because it is a mapped product, it can be applied or combined with any other mapped or geospatial information to derive other insights across other sectors in the industry, but also within other industries as well. So this just provides a little bit of a taster of what we do in ABARES and how we contribute to the portfolio's effort to advance First Nations outcomes in the industry. And with that, I'm now keen to take a seat and hear from our panellists on their insights and their respective work on Indigenous commercial opportunities and outcomes. So just lastly, if there's any further information or technical information that you'd like from any of the products that I've provided today, please take a look at our Forest Australia website via the link provided on screen. Thank you very much.